It's my pleasure to introduce our final featured speaker of this conference, Jessica Hische. She is a lettering artist and an author. Her first book, In Progress, was recently published by Chronicle. And in addition to all of her many accomplishments, which you can read about in your program, I would like to add that I think she is a compassionate observer and an insightful thinker about what it means to make art and to work in a creative industry. So let's give a round of applause for Jessica Hische.
That was such a wonderful introduction. I hope I live up to the compliment now. Awesome. So hi guys, my name is Jessica. I'm a lettering artist and author, as you guys have seen. And the title of my talk that I'm going to give today is called Know Thyself, though I'm kind of going to meander a little bit. I apologize if I talk really fast, but I naturally talk fast, and also I've had so much sugar in the last hour that I feel like I can see into the future. So I didn't really know what a lettering artist was when I was in high school, and I spent all of my time drawing shiny objects, apparently, with 2H pencils. I also didn't know what a lettering artist was when I was in college, and I was actually doing a lot of lettering for my graphic design projects. I was a graphic design major in college, and I found it like totally enlightening because unlike a lot of you in the crowd, I have a really hard time just like sitting down to make work without, or that's all about like, how do I want to express what's in my mind? And at age 18 and 19, I thought that I didn't have any thoughts that were worth sharing with the world, even though of course I did. So having the ability to express the ideas of a client or express the ideas of a project that was meant to simulate a client was just really mind-blowing to me. This project, which I'll just give a little brief intro to, was my thesis project for college, which I made a board game about divorce called Pack Your Baggage. And the entire premise was you had to move out of your parents' house with the least amount of emotional baggage. You would accrue emotional baggage by being caught doing things in rebellion of your parents' divorce, like, you know, fucking your teacher or whatever. I also curse a little bit. I'm sorry. I know that there were like 20 like Bible channels on the hotel TV, so I'm sorry if I offend anybody. You could accrue these sort of like guilt money bucks by catching your parents doing things that were actually not all that dissimilar to what you were getting caught doing. When I worked for Louise Feely after I graduated, I was basically doing lettering all day long from the second I got into the office till the second I left, but I still did not know what lettering was as a profession because I had always sort of thought of it as a thing that some graphic designers do. And even when I was off on my own creating illustrative lettering projects, to think about lettering as an industry onto itself was something that didn't even cross my mind. And part of this is like, I think, as a student, we are so concerned about sort of pumping in as much information as we can about like this main discipline that people are in, that sort of talking about the like tiny subdivisions that so many careers can take can seem intimidating, but really like, of course I wouldn't learn what it was to be a letterer when I was in school studying graphic design, because the only people hiring lettering artists were people in a creative director position, and it would be years before I would get there, and I'd probably figure it out on the job. When really, if I had known what lettering was from a younger age, I might have known that it was what I was supposed to do all along. So at the time, I called myself an illustrative designer. I actually kind of was an illustrator the whole time, and probably would have become an illustrator a lot earlier if my program at school. I went to Tyler School of Art in Philadelphia. Actually, whoop, Philadelphia's awesome. Yep, represent. If they had an illustration program, they sort of dissolved it into the graphic design program. I probably would have been an illustrator much earlier. I also was calling myself a designastrator a lot. I like making up words, and thankfully in my book that I published, they let me publish a lot of those words instead of editing them out, which was pretty fun. And then also the catch-all term of type nerd, which I embraced really fully and still embrace, even though now I know the differences between type and lettering. When I was 24, I got this tattoo on the inside of my bicep, which I was like, look how committed I am to my craft. Then after I started meeting a lot of like legitimate type nerds, people that have been in the type design and lettering industry for 20 or 30 years, they're like, you do realize that you have the word type on your arm in lettering. And I was like, wait, no way, the designers own the word type now. Everybody just uses that word. You guys need to give it up. And then I really started understanding the importance of the terminology the further I got into the career, because it really it changes a lot about what a client expects from you if you're using improper terms. And clients use improper terms with me all the time. They'll say like, oh, I want a font for this headline. And I'm like, you don't want a font, you want me to draw that headline because you clearly don't want the full alphabet like engineered into a piece of software that then you can future use. So sometimes I would brush it off as them just not knowing the right word, but sometimes that actually is what they wanted, and then we would have this big snafu going on in the project. So I now understand sort of the importance of the terminology. It wasn't really until I launched this project, Daily Drop Cap, which was the real big kickoff of my career as a freelancer. I had been freelancing while I was still working for Louise, and right when I quit working for her, I started this project to make sure that I was still drawing letter forms every day. But I still didn't really get that it could be my entire life. And the premise of the project was I would draw a letter a day and work my way through 12 alphabets. The number of the alphabets was really just like coming up with some cap to it so that I would know I would have a stopping point, and thinking that like, oh, 12 sounds good because maybe I'll make a calendar or something. And what this project ended up doing for my career was like unbelievable. For one thing, it made this kind of lookbook of all these different styles that I could work in, to the point where clients could go to this and reference it, which was something that I didn't realize was so important as an illustrator if you're working for larger commercial clients, because oftentimes they're selling through your work before you have the opportunity to sell yourself. So your work has to be there, and it gets so specific where I was up for a potential job for Starbucks when I was really young. Wyden & Kennedy was handling Starbucks at the time, and they reached out to me and said, can you send over a portfolio of all of your Christmas work? And I was like, why can't they just look at all of my work? Because clearly, like, a tree is a tree, and this is this. But they really needed, like, the specificity of, like, okay, well, if you're going to draw a tree, we have to know that you can draw a Christmas tree, even if you've drawn every other kind of tree before. So this really helped me in terms of client work. And then it also brought a lot of projects my way, the biggest one being Penguin Drop Caps. So I did a series with Penguin a year and a half, 2 years ago, where they hired me to do 26 book covers. And the premise was that each of the books had one giant initial cap on it, which was based on the author's last name. And sometimes when people would see this project, they would think that because it was labeled Penguin Drop Caps, that it was just borrowed drop caps from my Daily Drop Cap project. But really, each one was created individually, and based on the content, I had to read most of all of these books in order to do it. I think like the only couple that I skipped were Moby Dick, because I was like, it's going to be something with a whale, right? And but for the most part, I tried to have a good mix of something really narrative and something that was a little bit more subtle. And I do find that when working on any project that involves a subject matter that people feel incredibly close to, if you don't actually dive in as much as the audience is going to be diving in, all that you can do is skim the surface of what's available. And I think that people form real relationships with books, like, you know, like this book has been with them their whole life, especially when you're dealing with classics. And it's important to sort of acknowledge how important these pieces can be in someone's life, and that you have to treat it with as much reverence as they're going to treat it. So for my Daily Drop Cap project, I launched it as a website. I did a letter a day. I posted every day when I did the letter, and it brought a lot of people over to me to sort of like see what I was up to. I started getting asked to do speaking gigs, but I actually think that the thing that made me the most excited about that project, and the thing that actually made this project so successful, wasn't the artwork itself. It was this little bit, where the whole premise of the project was, I'm going to make these letters, but I want you to use these letters. So I gave people a little bit of code that they could use to then copy it into their personal blogs, so that they can actually use these letters on their own websites to help prettify the internet. And the like sharing aspect of this project, I think, is why it took off compared to a lot of other people's personal projects, because at the time there weren't as many like a thing I'm doing a day projects as there are now. Now you can't like spit without hitting one. But this part of it felt really different for people, and it felt more like a community engagement thing, and I think that's what really helped it take off. And then I became like completely obsessed with doing things that other people could use. I think that one of the reasons why I ended up in graphic design is that I'm really obsessed with making work that is useful, and I like feeling useful. I think that if I wasn't a designer, I would have probably ended up in ceramics or furniture or something in which I was creating an object that wasn't only beautiful but also could be used in the real world. And I think that a lot of my work revolves around doing that. A lot of my personal work revolves around doing that. So I created this website with my husband, Don't Fear the Internet. Basically, I forced him to work on it with me because I was very passionate about it. But I felt so empowered because I could build my own websites for my personal projects that I wanted to give other people that power by putting together like a very simple tutorial for people at the very early stages to kind of say, you know, it's okay if you don't want to switch careers and be a web designer, you can still, you know, look behind the scenes and incorporate this stuff into your work. When I was asked about, Google had done a thing where they had basically asked a bunch of artists to do work for free for the promise of exposure, and a lot of illustrators were getting interviewed about it, and rather than sort of answer, they're like, of course you shouldn't do it for free, blah, blah, even though it's really important, like, you know, exposure's important. I made this flowchart to sort of talk about the topic in a humorous way, but in a way that still expressed what my opinion was. So I made this should I work for free flowchart and just posted it as a website, shouldiworkforfree.com. And the premise is that ultimately you should never work for free if it's for a real client. And if you are working for free for someone, realize that you're doing something without the promise of something in return. Like, and if someone promises you something in return and that doesn't happen, you have to be okay with it. And then like the bottom one is it for your mom? And then it's like, yes, 22 hours of labor and you can't design one goddamn garage sale flyer. So there's a lot of things in our lives that, you know, I tried to keep it light. Speaking of moms, I made a website, Mom, This Is How Twitter Works, because I literally wanted to pull my mom away from Facebook and onto Twitter at the time. I was really obsessed with Twitter. Now my husband works at Facebook, so I probably can't do that. But this was seen as kind of like anti-feminist from some people because they thought I was talking about like moms as being untechnology savvy, whatever. But it was like literally directed at my mom. But I love being able to explain things in kind of like a humorous narrative way. So the whole premise of this was I was basically giving you my like family dynamic and being like, here's how we would interact on Twitter if that happened. And this still gets so much traffic and gets so many people writing me being like, thank you for making like what is the simplest tutorial on Twitter I have ever read. It needs to be updated pretty significantly, and then I made a website called Inkerlinker because I wanted to find printers and found that there wasn't a really great database other than like diving into like super nerd forums to try to find letterpress printers, offset printers, and digital printers, and it was all kind of based on referrals. So I wanted to do the research myself, but then put that research out there to other people. So that's one of the reasons why I'm so focused on making resources is that it always helps me, and I'm like, why would I not catalog this stuff to then help other people? And sometimes all it does is like fast track my referral ability. So if I find that I'm getting asked the same thing over and over again, rather than just answer that same thing over and over again, I try to create a project around it so that I can share that with a greater audience and like make it a lot easier to actually share that information myself. And one of the things that I love to share about and that I actually end up talking about a lot at conferences is process. And I have an artist rep, and my artist rep at first was like very anti me going around the world and telling all my secrets of how the donuts get made. And but I really believe that the more open we are about how we create, the more likely it is that people aren't actually going to directly rip us off, because I feel like the more you give back to a community, the more likely people are going to be aware that we're all individual human beings trying to make work and trying to get on in the world, rather than thinking of like a person as essentially a corporation. And so this is sort of my basic process, which I won't really outline because the slide's up. But one of the things I talk about when it comes to process is that you have to love every moment of creation, because like that's the only way to love your job. And I think that young artists get very obsessed with a title, or they get very obsessed with what the end result could look like, and then if the end result doesn't get there for whatever reason, like you feel like your life is wasted or that your time has been wasted. And I feel like we're so lucky as artists because so few people can so easily love their jobs. Like, if you think about how a lot of our relatives think about their careers, they think about what career can I take that's going to give me the most comfortable retirement. And that is like the most depressing thing on earth to me, is how do I spend the next 30 years making sure whatever time after that is comfortable? Like, I want to make sure that every minute of my day is spent doing something enjoyable. And I want to be in a career in which if I start considering the thought of retiring, I feel like I have to ask myself, like, wow, maybe something is going wrong if I want to step away from my work. And I think that that's something as artists that is really empowering, and why we, and I'll talk a little bit about this, about how we sort of have the most flexible careers in the world, because we want to make sure that we're working. And as this like gig economy and whatnot is happening, and that these 30-year jobs with the promise of retirement are less and less common, we're not only like built for it, but that's what we want. We want to be able to work until the day we die in some capacity. So one of the reasons why I also show process is I went to a talk one time, and this guy, Simple Scott, was giving a talk about branding, and I quoted him as, use process to distract dissent. The more you share about what you're doing, and you know this in critiques in art school, the less it is that someone's going to pick you apart. And I think that sharing to clients and to the people that we work with gives them a real understanding that we have put the thought behind it, and that's really important. I think that it's like, trust is such a hard thing to build with the people that we work with, and if they see all the thought that goes into something, then they inherently trust you, and then the project goes so much smoother. But really, like, one of the things that I love about process is my process brings all the boys to the yard. I worked on the MailChimp rebrand a couple years ago, and I posted a bunch of like little instructional slides onto my website of the before and after, and the reasons why I did what I did. It wasn't a huge write-up, it was just a couple of these images, and it blew up so completely because, for whatever reason, I guess, people just do not share behind-the-scenes stuff on branding very often, because there is this, like, if there's a mystery to it, if like, you know, like if you don't share everything that you're doing, then somehow it's like elevated in some way. But what ended up happening is that people started coming to me for like the MailChimp treatment, which isn't any different than what any other branding person would do. But clients really wanted to feel empowered to know what was actually doing. And if you think about it as like, when I'm doing this sort of work, when I'm doing these more subtle rebrand things, which I love because it really is so utility. Like, usually someone comes to me, the vision of the company's already figured out, and what they need is they need the logo updated, either to like bring it out of the 90s, or because they need to like make some adjustments to make it more legible, to work on different surfaces, whatever. And it really feels like I'm doing something that's incredibly useful. But when I think about a client hiring me to do this, if I was going to hire someone and I had a bunch of kind of like dissenting friends nearby that were like, why did you pay all that money to like basically do something so subtle that's unbelievable? If I could then, as the client, like go back to them and say like, because this, all the factual stuff that as a designer I can give to them, that I can empower them with, then not only do they feel more confident about the work that I've done for them, but they also basically advocate for my entire industry for me. And I think that process can do that. Like, if we open up our worlds to other people, it really makes people perceive our world differently. And people that wouldn't have even thought that someone would pay this much attention to the way that one letter joins to another, all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, if a person spends 8 hours just doing this, like, what else do people do? And then you start realizing how specific and specialized every artist is in the kind of work that they do. So I'll click through really quick this work I did for Retail Me Not. This was their original logo, which has its problems. But what they ended up doing is the CEO was obsessed with his logo, and so the branding team really wanted to redo it, but in order to convince him, I had to pretty much put together like a proof of concept deck, which this is my new favorite thing, is people paying me to criticize them. That sounds like a really great line of work. And so I put together this deck kind of outlining, like, here's the things that are screwy, here's what I would fix, this is like, you know, everyone would agree that this thing is wrong. I personally feel that this thing is wrong. So then they really understood that like I wasn't just going at it to like cash a check and to make some nonsense changes for no reason. There were like real legitimate reasons for making any updates that I was making. And the side benefit is that they can't unsee the things that I tell them, and then they're like, oh, well, clearly now I thought this was fine and it's not fine. And they move forward, and whether or not they hire me for it, they know they have to do something, because otherwise they're like, oh, I've just noticed the giant mole on my face for the first time. And what I love about this is I have a really specific education because of who I've worked for and because of the programs that I've been through. I studied at Cooper Union doing a continuing ed program in typeface design. I spent a lot of time hanging out with typeface designers, and they have a knowledge set that is so unique compared to even other graphic designers, and being able to sort of open that up to people is really fun and really exciting, and just sort of changes how people perceive anything that they see. So, and here's my sketch that I did showing what the final would look like, and here are some of the finals that I ended up making, with the last one, the one on the right being the very final. And a lot of times when I do these rebrands, what I'll end up doing is delivering a large-scale logo and a small-scale logo, and I could give a whole talk on like everything that goes into like why you make letterform decisions the way that you do, but just to like give a little brief like something. When you're doing something that's going to scale down, you always want to make sure that it has more generous letter spacing so that you can identify the letter forms better. Generally, also, you want a higher X height. So when you're choosing fonts, if you think about typesetting something and it's going to be really small, you want something where the lowercase letters come up a little bit higher compared to the uppercase letters. There's like a lot of these little things that I then explain to the client, and they're like, oh my God, who even knew? And it's just very exciting to me to be able to like teach people on a daily basis this very specific thing. So lettering has had like an outrageous explosion in the last few years. Like this is a Pinterest search for like chalk lettering or something. I don't do chalk lettering myself, but sometimes I do, I don't know. And it's just become such like a trendy field that it can be somewhat difficult to sort of differentiate yourself, especially if you do find yourself working with a very specific medium like chalk. But one of the things that I've like always done just for personal reasons, but also to make sure I always have a place in the world, is to make sure that my projects are really diverse. And that means stylistically, but also it means industry-wise. So one of the things that's really nice about being a lettering artist or an illustrator or a designer is that there are a lot of different industries that need your help. And then all of those industries have different ways of working, different timelines, different kinds of pay, also like different boom seasons and bust seasons. And so this is just a little sample of some of the different industries. I did the titles for Moonrise Kingdom, which is a Wes Anderson movie. I don't do a lot of film title work. It's usually not the most lucrative form of work to be doing, but I would love more opportunities to do it if it was a similar situation where I was working directly with the artists on the film rather than working with an agency. I do a lot of editorial work, though less now because people don't really know where to place a lettering artist in terms of editorial. A lot of stuff for advertising. I actually really like doing advertising work because like so much of what I enjoy about work is the actual process of making stuff rather than the like all of the preemptive thought and conceptual work that goes into it. I still like that, but that's not where like I have all my meditative I love being an artist time. Like once I have my sketch done and I can actually sit there and execute the final, like that's actually what aids in bettering my own mental health, is like that part of the process. And I think that that's why craft is important in that way for me personally, because I need to be able to have that time. Otherwise, I'm a crazy person. I have to spend way more time in therapy than I normally do. And I think that the more time I spend creating, the less time I spend unloading on my loved ones. Book covers are a big part. Anything that's like wearables, T-shirts, logotypes, cards and stationery, stuff for Criterion and other like sort of physical book-ish things, but are movie related, and also the wine industry and food industry. So there's so many different places where you can work, and each of these different industries has sort of their like super busy time. Like when you're talking about advertising, there's always like the holiday stuff, which happens in July. So if you're gonna do a holiday campaign, you're gonna get called in like June, July, or August to do a holiday campaign. And then with editorial, it's like every single month is a different thing, so that's like a little bit more constant. Books tend to have their like publishing schedules as well. And if all of your work falls within one industry, it can be really scary when all of a sudden that industry starts having problems or a certain client falls through or something like that. So making sure that you have your finger in enough pies really helps with sanity and with also making sure your career can keep going even in a recession. And each of these industries, like I said, is really different. Like books, and I love for different reasons. I love books because I love reading and researching and being able to actually create something from start to finish. I love like having a relationship with both the book and the readers of the book. I love how different each of them are. I think that this is the closest to graphic design that I get. And like as a graphic designer, you're sort of meant to be style agnostic, where you approach a project based on whatever the subject matter is, and you have to be like new every single time. But with a lot of commercial illustration and lettering, it is kind of about them hiring you for your specific style and you trying to like push it in a new direction every time, but knowing that you have this much narrower window to keep your work within. With advertising work, like I said, you're hired to do a really specific thing, but what I like about it is it's a weird way to collaborate with other industries. So this piece that I did for Starbucks, they ended up hiring someone to make a mold to then actually make the flan, to then photograph, to then have someone retouch it so it actually looks like flan. But the only thing that I actually delivered to them was this like black and white artwork that they used to make the mold. And I think that craft in general is a difficult industry to scale. Like certainly you can think about mold making and things like that to scale whatever you do, and you can industrialize your process. But I feel like this is the way that my craft scales but still remains like very much under my control, is that I contribute my small part to a larger project, working with other craftspeople to do their small part until the whole is larger than something I could create on my own. And then editorial is really fun just because of the variety and because of the tight timelines. I'm like entirely deadline, I need them. Like if you tell me I have all the time in the world and can do whatever I want, I will literally never do it. If you tell me I have 4 hours and it's due tomorrow, I'm like the most excited ever to do it. And I think we all have problems with time management, and I am a #1 perpetrator of that, and whatever I can do to make sure that I have restraints on my life, the better. And I think too, as someone that's been working for themselves for a number of years, I feel like what I thought freelance would bring me is freedom, you know, like the freedom to work when I wanted, to do what I wanted. But the older I get, the more I realize how important sort of a very tight process and a very like figured out tight schedule really benefits me for my sanity. I have also like a toddler, so that's, you know, a big thing that you have to work around. And the more I have my schedule sort of honed and the more I can kind of understand what the process is going to be, the better. I heard a quote recently that I really liked, which is, "The path of least resistance leads to a very crowded place." And this is one of the things that I think about a lot when I think about being an artist, is that we don't have a prescripted career. You know, like there are certainly ways to go about it where you're in art school and you're delivered like, oh, well, here's what you can do. You do this MFA, and then you do this fellowship, and then you apprentice for this person, and then you work with a gallerist, whatever, and then you're famous, whatever. But, I mean, maybe. But it's not like our lives are not like going into being a, registered nurse. They're not like going into being a 5th grade teacher. There is not a prescriptive path that everyone follows, that when you're in 4th grade, you decide you're going to be this thing, and then you just follow that path blindly until you get to that career. And because of that, because it's murkier, less people get to where we are. And I think because of that, and because it's murkier, and because we kind of have to make things up as we go and figure out what we want to do based on ourselves, not based on these hierarchical journeys to go through, we end up being in a position where we actually have more job security than a lot of people that have more prescriptive paths do. But one of the problems is, how do I get anyone to care? Like, how do I get anyone to care about my work? Because there's a zillion people making work. One of the things you can do is do something so incredibly specific and crazy that people can't not pay attention. My husband follows a lot of woodworkers on Instagram because he's really, really interested in Japanese woodworking. And one of the people that he follows is this guy that only makes miniaturized woodworking tools. And this is his whole thing. And he has like 30,000 followers on Instagram. And this seems like totally crazy to me to do something that is or to like commit yourself so fully to something that's so specific and so like useless, even though it's amazing and beautiful. But if you have that drive in you to do something that is so specifically you and so not something that it has an easy path to it, like I think that people can't not pay attention. That's a lot harder to find than my other suggestion is to help others along their path. And I think that not all of us are born with the teacher gene, but I think it can make an incredible difference to your own career the more you give back to your community. I love doing it just because I really do get, like that's where I get all of my joy, is just like sort of seeing other people get that aha moment that I had like a couple months ago about a project or a couple years ago about something. And like I think there's a lot of joy that I get from the actual creation of my work and making stuff that I'm proud of, but that's like the biggest thing. And so I do what I can to sort of like give back as much as I can by publishing articles on my site. I did a skill, like after I was doing workshops at my office, and they just became so popular, but so many people wrote me and said, like, I can't afford it, or I live in this city, like, what can you do? So I put together a Skillshare to basically take all the content from my workshop and make it more affordable and portable. And then ultimately my book ended up being the most portable version of that. And this stuff is kind of hard, it's much harder to do than to just do commercial lettering, but I do feel that like we are all the sum of all the people that helped put us where we are today. Like I don't think there's a person in this entire room that can't say that some amazing teacher or mentor like didn't help them in some outrageous way at some point in their life. And I think that it's really easy when you're young to think that you're not capable of that just because you're still so inexperienced and still relying so much on the people around you that are helping you. But I actually really try to empower people that are in their first couple years out of school trying to work to give back to their community then, because there's stuff that they can teach people that are just coming out of school that they are more directly connected to than I can, or that any of us can. So I think that it's such an important part about both keeping our craft alive and then also keeping your own career alive. So the last little bit I'll talk about is just sort of about self-awareness in general. And if you haven't really figured out what your path is, like how to think about finding it, I think I talk a lot about specialization just because as a freelancer, and I've heard people today talk a lot about how they don't want to be given a title, and I think that in general, like we're all bigger than our work. Like I never meet someone and go, oh, they're only a sculptor or they're only a this. Like, and I think that we all are capable of having empathy for everyone in like every problem that they're going through in their lives. But in terms of being a professional, especially a professional that does client work and has to interface with clients a lot, having a title is really important because almost all of my work comes through referrals. And if I'm not on the tip of someone's tongue when they're out at a party and someone asks them to recommend someone that does lettering work, then I am not doing my job. So I think that I'm a person that really embraces like my titles, and I know that I'm more than my titles. And to sort of find what you want people to refer you as, you have to ask yourself, what do I bring to the table that few people can? And then also, what should I take on and what should I delegate? And that has to do with acknowledging your strengths. Like all of us have things that we are like strong about, and be open and unashamed of your weaknesses. And I think that we try to suppress our weaknesses or try to fix them, when really sometimes they don't need fixing. Sometimes we just need to figure out how to incorporate them into our lives a little bit more streamlined. And when a lot of people think, like when designers think about how to describe themselves, especially young designers, they think of these two things. If you're in an interview and you're asked like, oh, well, what are your skills? They're usually technical skills, which is like, what programs do you know how to use? And then your design talent and experience, which is all the things that would be on your resume, your internships, et cetera. When really there are so many skills that contribute to how we work and that contribute to how we would be as an employee or how we would be as a coworker or whatever. And it's really important to take those into effect, that they impact what kind of work you want to take on and also what kind of places you want to work and who you want to work for. And so I have gotten increasingly analytical over the years and decided to make a chart of all the things that I'm good at or just okay at. I recommend doing this. It's a weird exercise. I feel like we don't, if you're not the most self-aware person or don't do a lot of introspective thinking, I live in the San Francisco Bay Area right now, so I do like acupuncture and all the California stuff you could even possibly imagine. And so I don't feel like I need more time to like think about my feelings, but I do feel like if you are not naturally prone to spending time alone, sort of figuring out what your motivations are and what you're best at and what you're worst at and how to work with that, doing it in a very analytical, like bird's eye view way can be really helpful. So what I sort of analyzed, did my clicker just die? Oh, there he goes. All right. Is that, like, my top skills are actually probably not design. They're, like, people skills, communication skills, empathy. I have, like, a really hyperactive empathy muscle. Like, you probably saw me crying in the audience yesterday. That's for various reasons, hormonal reasons as well. But I do feel like empathy can be such a strength. It can also be something that makes you incapable of handling the world, but it can be incredible for your work. And things that I'm not good at are punctuality. I'm just not good at that. I don't like being on a deadline. I don't like being on a social deadline. I like, work deadlines. And then openness to criticism. I take criticism really personally sometimes. But the thing is, if you're aware of the things that you're worse at and are either actively trying to improve them or are just acknowledging them, then you can at least move on. And I think that that is really important. I think that's something that's come up in this election too, is that like, while things are crazy, it's at least brought a lot of things to the surface that probably needed to be surfaced. And I think that it's important to do that in ourselves, that, like, it's not about suppressing the things about us that we don't like. It's about acknowledging that they're there and either working to actively change them or working to find a way to, work around them. I frequently fall behind on email and paperwork, so I hired someone to help me with that, and it's made a huge difference. I think that figuring out how to delegate parts of your work that you're not good at or work with an assistant and stuff like that, I think it's really important, and we shouldn't feel like the entire world falls on us. So what I sort of figured out is, like, I'm really good at working on highly detailed projects, but I'm also passionate about, education and explaining process, which clearly comes through with what I've shown. So every person has a unique set of strengths and weaknesses that influence his or her chances to succeed, and the key is really like understanding them and knowing how to work with them so they don't work against you. So ultimately, you've got to know thyself, and I made a little thing for this. I don't know. You maybe saw me working on it in the crowd. But I do feel that understanding who you are and using that knowledge to figure out your artistic path is really important. I think that fine artists do it a lot more because they make more introspective work more often. But as a commercial artist, I think we're tasked a lot to remove ourselves from it and to make it all about, like, how do I solve this problem the best? But I actually feel like if you understand yourself and what your motivations are, it just really helps in every way to figure out what kind of work you're interested in doing and how you're going to best contribute to the work that you're being asked to do. So that is all. Thank you.